what is colonization? Why is decolonization needed? Right? Because I realize that a lot of people, even today, the educated people, in fact, the more educated people, are not even aware that they are colonized, you know. So first they need to create an awareness on what is colonization, then decolonization, and then we look at psychology, how the I would say the not the modern psychology, but the conventional mainstream psychology today, how it is different than the indigenous psychology, not just in India, but in many other parts of the world. What is happening in most of the part of the world, this is like second or third or even fourth generation that is colonized. And therefore, even the memory of the indigenous culture or their original root is being erased, right? And it is replaced. So colonization is not just a political or military taking over of a country, but it is taking over of a country as an entire culture, as society, as way of life, and also as education, because education then becomes a very strong tool to ingrain at one level. And what is happening beautifully, it's maybe the rise of consciousness at a cosmic level, that many cultures, around the world are waking up now to their own indigenous psychology. Why? Because as you rightly said in the introduction, the epistemology means how does knowledge happen, right? And there is a beautiful book called the Epistemology of the South, where you realize that, these northern countries have dominated the worldview. Now, what is important, why it is important to go back to indigenous psychology also, is that we, without realizing, our worldview gets colored, our self-view gets colored, and therefore our way of living and way of being becomes colonized.
Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Indic Talks. Today we shall discuss decolonization of psychology. Modern science has been used as a strategic colonization tool and dominated education in the colonies. Epistemologies produced in Europe and the United States of America. Epistemologies that have been considered superior, scientific, and universal. Life has been cut off from the roots of Mother Nature and regenerative living. Most of the malice that the world is facing today is a result of this thinking. Psychology is one of the paths forward for human flourishing through decolonization of psychology. To elucidate this, we have our speaker today, Dr. Mala Kapadia ji, who is a highly accomplished scholar and practitioner with a distinguished career spanning research, education, journalism, human resources, and consulting. She is a passionate advocate for integrating ancient Indian wisdom with modern approaches to well-being, leadership, and organizational development. Dr. Kapadia is currently the Director of Center for Indigenous Knowledge Systems at Anaadi Foundation and the Principal Investigator for a Ministry of Education Indian Knowledge Systems research project on well-being and happiness based on Ayurveda. I will take this opportunity to welcome ma'am warmly and also request her to give us an overview of what our viewers can expect from today's talk.
Namaskaram and dhanyavad, Ojaswi. My gratitude and thanks to Indus Academy and University, because you have been doing wonderful work in creating this awareness for, why Indian knowledge systems are required. And this is more like a continuity of our earlier interview, right? So we talked so much about education in general, and now let's focus on psychology. So in this episode, what the viewers can expect is we look at more in depth about what is colonization, why is decolonization needed, right? Because I realize that a lot of people, even today, the educated people, in fact, the more educated people, are not even aware that they are colonized, you know. So first they need to create an awareness on what is colonization, then decolonization, and then we look at psychology, how the I would say the not the modern psychology, but the conventional mainstream psychology today, how it is different than the indigenous psychology, not just in India, but in many other parts of the world. And later on, maybe if we have time, then we can look at more depth on Bharatiya psychology, which is the indigenous psychology from Bharat.
That sounds very exciting. Ma'am, my first question actually is about how psychology, in layman understanding, has always been thought to be a giving of the Western world to the rest of the world. So, when somebody talks about decolonization, one assumes that for decolonization to happen, psychology has to be Indian first. But many people don't even know that there is an Indian psychology or there is an Indic psychology in the first place. So,
True.
what is this Indic psychology that we're talking about that we are trying to decolonize?
Okay. So before we get into this, right, and as you also rightly pointed out, what is colonization, right? And that, unless we are aware, because I think what is happening in most of the part of the world, this is like second or third or even fourth generation that is colonized. And therefore, even the memory of the indigenous culture or their original root is being erased, right? And it is replaced. So, colonization is not just a political or military taking over of a country, but it is taking over of a country as an entire culture, as society, as way of life, and also as education, because education then becomes a very strong tool to ingrain at one level what they call scientific from the weird world. Now, what is weird is also very interesting in the field of psychology. It is westernized, educated, industrialized, relational, and democratic. So, this weird definition, right? And these weird countries are mostly American and European. And their worldview or their science is seen as scientific, while all the knowledge that exists in a country which they have colonized becomes marginalized, unscientific, or even maybe named as superstition. Right? So one, people need to understand that colonization happens at a very subtle level. So slowly over the years, you start disbelieving your own culture. You start disbelieving knowledge and wisdom from your own country, your own culture. And it is slowly and strategically replaced by the Western education. So your language is seen as inferior. English is seen as a better language, a globalized language. So there was a very interesting question that I encountered, that even when we globalize our students, right, especially today in every humanities, sciences, in management education, we talk of globalizing students so that they have exposure to the larger world. But the moment we say globalization, whose stories are we including and whose stories are we excluding? Who is the doorkeeper? So this is a very, very subtle game played by the Western countries, and people don't realize. People don't realize that their own knowledge is considered as marginalized, though it is very scientific, right? So colonization needs to be understood. The moment we create an awareness of what is colonization and what it has done to people in different countries, then we can come to decolonization. Because first is the self-awareness, and self-awareness leads to action. And the action can happen at two levels. One, of course, at individual level, right? Like for you also, your exposure to the mainstream curriculum of psychology and the Indic psychology that you are talking about now are such different streams of knowledge, right? And we accept the Western psychology. I mean, now we are limiting it only to psychology, but it can happen to economics, it can happen to physics, chemistry, healthcare sciences. It's been happening in every field of education. Even education itself is so colonized that we don't even realize that it is colonized. And therefore, decolonization is the first step of self awareness. Self awareness then leading to one, individual action, and then two, collective action, which we are trying to do through these webinars and workshops, where people collectively come together. And there is a aha feeling that, oh, this is like a mask that I was wearing, right? And I can throw away the mask. I can connect with my original self.
Ma'am, I would like you to shed light on how indigenous psychology is rooted within Bharatiya Shastra, and how it is important to decolonize it, because there is a scope of psychology that goes beyond just its academic pursuit.
Absolutely. And before we come to Indic psychology, let me take a little detour to what is indigenous psychology, right? Because Indic psychology is certainly indigenous psychology. And what is happening beautifully, it's maybe the rise of consciousness at a cosmic level that many cultures, around the world are waking up now to their own indigenous psychology. Why? Because as you rightly said in the introduction, the epistemology means how does knowledge happen, right? And there is a beautiful book called The Epistemology of the South, where you realize that, oh, these northern countries have dominated the worldview. Now, what is important, why it is important to go back to indigenous psychology also, is that we, without realizing, our worldview gets colored, our self view gets colored, and therefore our way of living and way of being becomes colonized, right? And therefore, the epistemology of each country needs to be revisited, right? What has happened is with colonization, and therefore the Western worldview, which came as a very strong view on putting men as a center. So when human being is the center of your epistemology, then your entire science is looking from a very, very different lens to the world. And then what happens? Nature becomes your resource. Nature is there to be exploited, right? And this is the entire Descartes plus Cartesian split which came between us and nature. While when we look at Indic psychology or any of the indigenous psychology, human being is not at the center, but cosmos and creation is at the center. And one very strong reason why we have to go back to indigenous and Indic psychology is also the state of the world where we are. Because this era is also called as Anthropocene, which means the ecological disaster that we are seeing around is caused by our way of living and being, right? So if we are at center, in fact, our responsibility should have been much more. Instead, human beings have, in spite of calling themselves the most intelligent species on the planet, they have lived very irresponsibly. They have lived a very myopic way. And that is the reason of colonized way of looking at life. Now, when we look at the crisis that is created by Anthropocene way of living, happens at 4E, right? So one, ecology, we are seeing the climate change and the disasters that are striking many countries, right? I mean, recent Australian cyclone and the disaster it has caused is really worrying. The second crisis is economic. A lot of countries are declaring economic recession. What is also happening connected to these two, ecology and economic, is emotional crisis. World over, there is not just economic recession, but post-pandemic, organizations are declaring that there is emotional recession. Why emotional recession? Because emotionally, people are not experiencing well-being and happiness, right? There is a lot of anxiety, there is a lot of loneliness, there is disengagement from work, which is increasing. The basic foundational questions of who I am and why am I living and how should I live are coming back in each individual's life, and also therefore are getting reflected collectively. However, what we don't realize that the 3E, right? Ecology, economics, emotions are ultimately a result of ethical crisis. And when I say ethics and connecting it to Indic psychology, it is the dharmic crisis, right? Because for us, even when we talk of four purushartha, dharma should guide artha and kama. Unfortunately, in the colonized world, what is guiding artha and kama is guiding our life without dharma. So dharma is not religion as it is generally translated, but dharma is coming from etymologically dhru, dhri, one that holds, one that sustains. Right? So when we go back and talk of Indic psychology or Indian psychology or indigenous psychology, whatever, Bharatiya psychology, whatever we prefer to name it, it's ultimately going back to dharma at center. And this is what I've been looking at indigenous psychology in Australia, indigenous psychology of Maori in New Zealand, and what they call are slightly different words, but the essence is the same. So they also talk of creation, they talk of cosmos, they talk of Mother Earth at being at center. And that's why we realize that in New Zealand, even mountains and rivers are known as sacred. They have rights. So if a mountain is known as sacred, you cannot go hiking on that mountain. So that sacredness, because of dharma, which was at the center of our existence, is being sidelined. And with Indic psychology or indigenous psychology, we can bring that sacredness back to the center. So this is the main reason why we need to revisit the colonization and get into decolonization. However, one very paradoxical situation that we see in research literature is that globally there is a rise in indigenous psychology. And I was looking at some history. Let me share with you some names which are very interesting. Franz Fanon is called the father of decolonization. As well as being a psychiatrist, he is also called the father of indigenous psychology. He was a French psychiatrist, lived his life between 1925 and 1961, so a very short life. He was an Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist. But the interesting part is that he spoke of indigenous people, Black people, their psychology, their way of living, right? However, even before him, there is W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1903 wrote a book called The Soul of Black Folk. And the Soul of Black Folk is all about indigenous psychology. So global psychology, which we now have started talking about in Bharat as Bharatiya psychology, goes back internationally when we look at it way back in the early 19th century. However, the paradox is that in 2010, we have APA, American Psychology Association, coming in and taking charge of indigenous psychology as a part of the APA group, calling global psychology as a part of APA. Now, isn't that a paradox? Because American psychology is something from which we need to decolonize psychology and create the awareness of Indic psychology or indigenous psychology. However, we need internationally, not maybe now here so much, but internationally, there was this need to integrate APA's, like, a permission for indigenous psychology to be accepted. However, there is something very interesting that has been happening between, which is a distinguishing feature between indigenous psychology and what I call the conventional psychology, or people call it as a mainstream psychology, right? It's a mainstream psychology only because of the colonization. And before I get into this, I would like to share a brief history of my own journey and how I came into today talking about indigenous and Indic psychology, or creating Bharatiya psychology curriculum and awareness about it. Way back in 1979, I joined St. Xavier's. I graduated from St. Xavier's College in psychology. And to be honest, that was my day when I realized that no psychology anymore in my life. I was thoroughly disappointed with the Western curriculum in psychology, to which I couldn't connect. My heart didn't connect. Okay, the brain says you have chosen a subject, you need to study, try to understand a different worldview. However, that worldview itself was a challenging part to me. Why? Because human beings were not studied as human beings, right? I mean, psychology is supposed to be a science of psyche. Psyche means soul. But where is the soul or study of soul in the entire history of what we call as science of psychology? So it is devoid of spirituality or devoid of soul, right? What did it started focusing on? Behavior and pathology. Also, when we say behavior, how was human behavior understood or studied? By looking at rats, dogs, and monkeys. I mean, let's look at a simple classical conditioning theory where Paulo studied a dog and created this classical conditioning theory. And I'm shocked and surprised that all these years, these theories have been taught into the mainstream curriculum. The psychology of a dog and psychology of human beings ideally should have been very different streams of sciences or psychology. Unfortunately, we looked at rats and pigs and monkeys and dogs to understand human beings. So let's look at my own journey as a departure from the mainstream psychology. But psychology never left me. Though I decided that I don't want to study psychology at all now. However, it lingered at the back of my mind that if this is not mainstream psychology, if this is not real psychology or ideal psychology, what can be the real psychology? Because ultimately, psychology is a very important science in our life. It's a science of our psyche. It helps us understand our being. And therefore, I realized that Abraham Maslow and Carl Jung continued in my life journey. Much later, after exploring many other areas in my academics and academic career, corporate career, studying Ayurveda and yoga, I realized that, oh, now many dots are getting connected. With these dots getting connected, I realize that, okay, why my disappointment with what we call conventional psychology? It's a very valid and justified disappointment. And I'm not abnormal, I'm not alone, because animal behavior to study human beings and also looking at pathology as a center of our survival or our existence is not the right way of looking at people. If you look at the history of psychology, the conventional or mainstream psychology, they have taken more than 200 years to even come today to what was the foundation of indigenous or Indic psychology, and I'll take you through that. But let me give you few differences between what is indigenous psychology and Indic psychology or Bharatiya psychology being part of indigenous psychology, the bigger, larger umbrella, versus or is as opposed to the conventional psychology. What is at the center, as I said, Earth, creation, or cosmos is at center. While in conventional psychology, man is the center. And we can understand that how the entire worldview becomes very different when we see ourselves in relation to creation, the life as a presence itself, put ourselves in a very vast canvas as versus putting our own ego or our own existence at the center and looking at everything around us as a resource for us to be used, exploited, and without realizing ultimately where did it lead us? It made us look at other human beings, not just nature, not just animals, but also other human beings as a resource. So when we look at indigenous psychology, also what becomes the center? The heart. The heart becomes a center, while in conventional psychology, it is still the brain which is the center, right? I mean, when we look at psychology, there is hardly any mention of heart as a center. Heart as a center of learning, heart as a center of consciousness, heart as a center of living. And today, what positive psychology is talking about, though they are looking at positive psychology also as a cognitive psychology, ultimately they have to come down to the heart for gratitude, for experiencing joy, for experiencing relationship, meaning, and a purposeful life. As I also mentioned, when we look at life in relation to the creation, life itself becomes sacred. And therefore, this psychology, the indigenous psychology, helps us look at sacredness of everything around us. While here there is a Cartesian mechanical way, Newtonian mechanical way of looking at the world. In indigenous psychology, time is cyclical, right? Time is not linear. Here, time is linear. And I found that this makes a huge difference on how the time and the space concept creates our way of living. So in all indigenous cultures, ancestors they have not disappeared from your timeline, but ancestors are a continuity. And therefore you realize that when we look at Western psychology or the conventional psychology, there is no mention of ancestors being a part of your life. In indigenous psychology, children and elders are given great importance. Why are they given importance? Because they are the ones who live from the heart. And these are the ones who have the wisdom, which is keeping them interconnected with nature and each other. So your community, nature, the larger cosmos, and the interconnectedness plays a role. While here, the entire psychology is individual based. Society, we have branches like social psychology, but the role of community in creating health and well being is not given as importance and prominence in conventional psychology. Harmony and balance are of great importance in indigenous psychology, while control and command, which has been dominating the management world or the industrialized world, becomes also a part of psychology. Material and spiritual worlds don't have a separation, they are a continuum, right? Because you see time as continuum, you see our existence as continuum, while here it's more focused on the material world. Also, because of the connection with creation or cosmos or life processes itself, indigenous psychology becomes by nature very inclusive and integrative. Why? Diversity is respected, right? Diversity is understood. What we realize here, because of the focus on individual, diversity is not respected, diversity is not taken into consideration, and therefore you create the normal curve where an individual has to fit into what is considered a standardized norm. And all these norms, this is where the epistemology has to be revisited, because all the norms, though they call it universal, they are not universal, they are more culture bound. And these cultures are North American or European. And isn't that a very, very colonized way of projecting a science? Because what is local is branded or shown as universal. So whether we look at any of the psychometric assessment, well-being and happiness scales and surveys, the norms that are given are local for the weird countries. However, in reality, when we look at indigenous psychology, there is a different research methodology or a different way of communicating what is normal. Because what we have started considering as normal is not natural. Indigenous psychology is so rooted in nature, and therefore diversity is respected much more. So we need to redefine indigenous psychology. I mean, I don't want to sound disrespectful, but somewhere I realize that conventional psychology is in reality like a fish in fish tank. For a fish, the fish tank is the entire universe, right? But when you are seeing the fish from outside, you realize that the fish is found only confined to the fish tank. So the foundation, what has been the foundation of indigenous psychology? Nature, creation, community, right? Which is now seen as emerging fields. I mean, unfortunately, if you Google out indigenous psychology, Wikipedia will tell you that indigenous psychology is an emerging field of psychology. While in reality, and this is the colonized view of indigenous psychology, in reality, indigenous psychology is as ancient as our Vedic times, is as ancient as human existence, and all the communities of indigenous people who were living psychology, who were living the philosophy of psychology. They may not have created curriculums like Western psychology has, but they lived psychology. It was an applied psychology. So this is another distinction between indigenous psychology and conventional psychology. Here it is life and application based, while in conventional psychology, it is research based. And therefore, we realize that all the flourishing, the modern terms or the new fields, emerging fields in conventional psychology, like peace psychology, positive psychology, health psychology, ecological psychology, evolutionary psychology. These are supposed to be emerging, newly found fields in conventional psychology. However, all these were integrated and they were rather a foundation of indigenous psychology, where individual well-being and health, individual flourishing, and planetary flourishing is interconnected and a continuum, right? So we've looked at all the differences between indigenous psychology and the conventional psychology.
It's so interesting. So many things can be taken in from that answer, and we can dive into it. So one of the things that you actually explained was the fact that how current pursuit of psychology has been cut off from Mother Nature and regenerative living. So that would be one of the things I would like you to touch back on, although you gave so many examples. And another thing that you mentioned was positive psychology. So I would want you to tell us, how is positive psychology today different from Indian psychology?
Okay, so now before I answer that, let me answer what is Indian psychology, right? So Indian psychology is, there is no field, right? So if you go and look at Vedic literature, you look at Upanishad, you look at Ramayana and Mahabharata, you look at Puran, various Puran, but you will not find psychology as a branch, because psychology was never a separate branch of education. Psychology was integrated from Rigvedic rishis, their quest to understand the creation, their quest to understand the cosmos, resulted into intuitive knowledge, which can be taken out within the reference, within the context, but which can be taken out, and we can create the Indian or Bharatiya psychology curriculum out of that. Simplest example is Yajurveda. In Yajurveda, there is this sutra which talks about manas. What is manas? What is nature of manas? How does it function? What is it made up of? And what it should do in our, what should be its role in our life. And the line that continues with every shloka there is Mana me Shiva Sankalpam Astu. My manas has to be filled with Shiva Sankalpa. And Shiv is one of the primordial energy that has been guiding our rishis. And even today, Mahashivratri has just gone, right? We today also worship Shiva, not just as an outer manifestation in Shivalinga, but Shiva represents Loka Kalyana. Shiva represents well-being and wellness of every being in the cosmos. And let me just tell you a very, very short story, right, from our Purana. And many of us know the story of Sati and Shiva. And Sati was a daughter of Daksha Prajapati. Daksha was the king and a very powerful king. However, his entire focus was more on materialistic life, materialistic world. And therefore, when he was doing a yajna, he invited all the kings, all the rishis, all the Devi Devtas. But Shiv was not invited. And Parvati, Sati, in that avatar, Sati, who was a wife of Shiva, felt very bad, felt very insulted. And she puts herself into the fire of the yajna to annihilate herself, because she was very hurt and in grief because of her husband's insult. Now, what does this signify? Who is Shiv? Who is Sati? And what is the yajna without Shiv? What is the significance of yajna with Shiv? or manas with Shiva Sankalpa, and yagya or manas without Shiva Sankalpa. And this is where, when we look at our life today, the 4E crisis that I talked about, the ecological, economic, emotional, and ethical. In Ayurveda, life is defined as Hita Ayu or Ahita Ayu, Sukha Ayu or Dukha Ayu. And when we look at our life today, the VUCA and then the pandemic world, right? VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The VUCA world and the pandemic world are actually a result of living life without Shiva Sankalpa. Now imagine, our roots of psychology go back into the Vedic times, into the Vedic literature, right? Because that was a way of life, way of being. And that was our quest to understand the creation, understand who we are in relation to the creation, not just a Darwinian evolutionary theory, not just looking at monkeys to understand human beings. Right? In Dashavtar, we have our own story of evolution, but that evolution is more of consciousness rather than the body, rather than the form or the materialistic world. So, Indic psychology is rooted in this quest, which is around creation and which is around understanding ourselves. So, in Indic psychology, what I realized as I started connecting dots, or I would say, I mean, it's even an ego to say that I started connecting dots. It's some divine power that helps you, giving you insights like, okay, these are the dots that you know, and now these are the threads. This is how they are connected. And that curriculum, what I have been able to design, and what I call the Indic psychology or the Bharatiya psychology, and I'm not the only one, right? So many people have walked on this path before me, and everyone has given their own contribution, to which I have created my own contribution. So, what I realize is that the way to understand self is to understand you and the cosmos as one. We've all heard the saying macrocosm and microcosm, right? Yat pinde tat brahmande. Pinda and brahmand are the same. So if pinda and brahmand are the same, then we have to see ourselves the way quantum physics or quantum mechanics is looking at the world. And this is the beauty of Ayurveda, from where I have been able to take out a lot of Indic psychology insights. Begins with Bhautik Vigyan. It begins with Padartha Vigyan. It begins with quantum physics. And what is Bhautik and what is abhautik? What is Padartha? What is self and what is cosmos? That's the journey. And isn't it unfortunate that today, when people take up Ayurveda as a specialization to study, they are unable to understand this language because their entire school education is done from the colonized or Western way of looking at human body and looking at the world. So what they study in physics, what they study in biology, what they study in whatever little psychology or sociology that they study is totally from the colonized way or the colonized education. And therefore, to suddenly understand that, oh, I am the same as the cosmos, that understanding, that awareness expands us, expands who we are. So when you look at Panch Mahabhuta, you realize that, oh, me and the Akash are the same. There is Akash within me at a physical level, and there is Akash within me at my mind level. So when you look at different facets of philosophy, You realize that there is something, when you integrate yoga also along with the Ayurveda, you realize that there is something called Chida Akash, right? In your Agya Chakra, in your own self, there is a Chitta Akash. You also realize that in your heart, there is Dahara Akash. So the entire consciousness of Akash is within us. And therefore, obviously, when we understand ourselves and you realize that there is a therapy called Sattva Vajay Chikitsa, which helps people connect with their own Sattva. Sattva is the purest energy from where our manas is made up of. However, Sattva is also infused with Rajas and Tamas, so Triguna. Along with Panch Mahabhuta, we need to understand Triguna. And the moment we start integrating Panchamahabhuta and Triguna and create a matrix, that matrix creates the understanding of who I am at a self level. And this becomes the beginning of our journey in Indic psychology. And then, of course, we need to understand our anatomy, our biology, which is not just physical body, but which is also our Sukshma Sharira and Sthul Sharira, which is also not just the nervous system. We accept nervous system, right? Though we can't see it, but we accept that there is a nervous system within our body. The same way, there is energetic existence of chakra in our body. And there are 7 major chakras, but there are various minor chakras throughout our entire body, which connect us with the energy of the cosmos. So this expanded understanding of our biology, our anatomy, can help us understand our psychology much better. And then we need to also integrate the understanding of the role of heart in learning. First of all, in learning. Anything that I learn, the Western education tells us that we learn in the brain. Everything is only cognitive. And therefore, you realize when you look at, whether it's the field or science of psychology or positive psychology, you see everything as a cognitive skill. The question that Ojasvi asked me was about positive psychology and Indic psychology. And I would like to talk about 2 models that I have seen in positive psychology. One is the Spire model, and one is the PERMA model. The PERMA model is by Martin Seligman, right? And the Spire model, I'm not getting the name, it will come to me in a while and I will share. So the PERMA model says positive psychology is positive emotion, engagement, relationship, meaningfulness, and achievement or accomplishment. And the way it is described, it's beautiful. It's a great deviation from the entire journey of positive psychology, which naturally now can be termed as negative psychology, right? Because now if we are talking of positive psychology, though it talks of positive emotions, which are important for a human being to experience or live positive psychology, the positive emotions are not dealt with the holistic or inclusive understanding of manas and psyche or the spiritual aspect. Again, a lot of literature in positive psychology that integrates spirituality, but they look at spirituality only as purpose in life, calling in life, or meaningfulness. The purpose, meaningfulness, and calling in life certainly is spirituality, but that alone is not spirituality. Spirituality is self-transcendence. We realize in the literature of Abraham Maslow that he came quite close when he talked of self-transcendence. However, it is seen as a highest need of growth need beyond self-actualization and which needs our outgrowing of the basic or the deficit needs, right? However, when we look at Indic psychology, I would invert the entire pyramid of Maslow and say that Indic psychology begins with self-transcendence. Because the moment I look at myself as cosmos, myself as microcosm, it certainly is stress, self-transcendence from a very limiting understanding of me as a body and brain. And this is very critical. This is a very critical difference between positive psychology from the West and our Indic psychology from Bharat. So Bharat has to develop a voice, right? Bharat needs to develop a voice. Now let's take this understanding a step further. When I say SPIRE model, it again talks of uh, spirituality, positive psychology, uh, intelligence, relationship intelligence, and emotional intelligence, right? Spiritual intelligence. However, when we look at these models, they are still at a body level, they are still at a cognitive level. They have not gone beyond the body brain metrics. Now, let's look at few other fields which are a part of psychology, but they have not created a larger impact on how the curriculum or research methodology in psychology are getting impacted. One such field which is of my great interest is psychoneuroimmunology. While I was doing my own research early 2000 on emotional intelligence, I came through an interview of Candace Pert, who's supposed to be the queen of psychoneuroimmunology, where psychology and neurology and immunology, which is our ability to fight a disease, right? Our immune system and our nervous system and our psychology are all coming together in PNI. And she has written beautiful work on molecules of emotion, where she talks of how our mind, and she comes very close because she admits the influence of the sciences of Ayurveda and yoga in her work. So she comes very close to what Ayurveda and yoga have been talking about manas. And she says that mind is floating in our body. Mind is like mini brain going around in our body. And this is exactly what in Ayurveda we call manovaha srotas. So manas flows in the body. Manas is in every cell of the body. And Candace Pert talks about neuropeptides. And she says that every emotion is connected with neuropeptides in our body. And in different parts of the body, it fits in like a lock and key. And that's how different emotions get aroused within us. And I found a very, very old learning that post leaving St. Xavier's and psychology when I was studying my post graduation in Gujarati Sahitya, and where I studied Kavya Shastra and Navarasa, I realized that in the Kavya Shastra, you study Sthai Bhav. You study emotions, right? Kavya Shastra is science of emotion, science of aesthetics. And there are, till Bharat Muni, there were 8 emotions. And later on, Abhinav Gupta added ninth emotion of peace, Shantrasa. And now you see, connected to positive psychology, peace is called the emerging field in the conventional psychology. Peace psychology is a separate field. However, way back, Abhinav Gupta added Shant Rasa as one of the basic emotion or Sthai Bhav, a permanent emotional template within us. And PNI or psychoneuroimmunology, the insights from Candace Pert's work come very close to the understanding of sthai bhava and why do we experience certain emotions. So when we are, of course, the entire Kavya Shastra is limited to literature or performing arts as Natya Shastra. However, it also relates and gives us great insights into understanding our everyday life, our emotional intelligence. So Natya Shastra gets connected with making us emotionally intelligent by helping us understand which sthai bhava is more dominant in us. So when we say Navarasa, is Raudra or anger more dominant in us? Is Karun or sadness more dominant in us? So is this how, if we integrate this understanding of self from the lens of Natya Shastra or Kavya Shastra into therapy? Imagine most of the therapeutical techniques from the conventional psychology are again related only to brain. It's only now that nutrition is being seen. And though the words sattvic, rajasic, tamasic food is still not a part of nutritional science, but they are realizing that certain foods affect our moods or affect our self, our emotions in a positive or a negative way. However, when we look at Kavya Shastra or emotional intelligence from Kavya Shastra lens, we realize that each emotion can exist within us as a raw memory, a sanskara, and it gets activated by outside event. Now, in Natya Shastra or Kavya Shastra, the outside event is either a performance, a dance, a literature that we are reading. It could be a poetry or a fiction. However, or a cinema that we are viewing, right? However, when we look at it from our daily perspective, our day-to-day incidences, all our interactions with other people that ignite these emotions within us can be in a raw memory or our sanskara, and they all can be transformed. Nothing is useless, nothing is negative from our Shastriya perspective. So anger has its own utility. Raudra ras can be beautiful, it can be useful, it can be transformed into action by challenging the status quo, by becoming an activist, by removing what we see as adharma or what we see as not the right way of behavior or something in our society that we need to change. So Raudra ras or anger can actually become a good catalyst for social change. The same way what we can see is sadness, right? Karun ras. Now look at the play of words in Sanskrit. Karun can become karuna. So karun or sadness can be transformed into compassion. It can be transformed into, again, a catalyst as a compassion. So you do not get drowned into your own sadness. You do not get cut off from the cosmos or creation, right? And this is the challenge in modern psychology or the conventional psychology. Because if you are individual based therapy, then in your story, you are the hero or heroine. And therefore, your emotion, which is bound by your ego, is very difficult to transform. But when we realize that, okay, we are dynamic beings, we are bhu, we are made up of pancha mahabhuta, we are evolving beings, then it becomes much easier to transform our emotions. And the karuna can actually become karuna. That karuna can actually change the world. Because the biggest crisis today is lack of compassion. This lack of compassion can be seen from increasing in individuals and society collectively as something which is a result of post-industrial revolution. Because in industrial revolution, what happened? People were uprooted from the local or the village or the community setting where they were rooted in a place where they were born. There was uprootment, from there, that their roots, to bring them to cities, to bring them to factories. Here they were connected with nature, they were connected with their community, they were connected with the soil, right? And it was the soil and community which was nourishing their soul. Their life revolved around natural circadian rhythms, right? Their seasons, there were festivals connected with harvest and every indigenous culture. And therefore, celebrating these festivals, celebrating Mother Nature, celebrating change of seasons is a very strong, integrated, and integral part of indigenous and Bharatiya psychology, which we find missing in Western or conventional psychology. So, lack of compassion, because naturally, when you are uprooted, you are bleeding. This has become, we have not realized, but this uprooting from nature has become our intergenerational trauma. And it is this trauma which is overwhelming us. It is this trauma which is creating stress within us. And therefore, when there is no compassion for nature, when we are exploiting nature as a resource, when there is no compassion for people, when people have become resource, when people are being exploited, right? The entire psyche of killing the competition, we call it a rat race, we call it a dog eats dog kind of culture. And the entire vocabulary is without compassion. And how do we bring back compassion? Because compassion, again, is not a cognitive skill. Compassion is a value or a virtue of our heart. So what I would say that what Bharatiya Manas Shastra or Indic psychology does is, first, it gives us a metacognition. The metacognition is who we are in relation to the entire creation, right? So we are the creation, we are a part of the life process. When we have this metacognition and awareness, obviously what happens? We are rooted in our values. So we are connected with meta values. So compassion becomes a meta value, which guides our decisions, right? So let's say one of the decision, and I was with a friend of mine in a hotel recently, and I realized that though she was carrying her own toothbrush, which was in the bag, and she didn't want to open the bag, so she opened up the toothbrush, which is offered by the hotel in a bathroom. Now, this is a natural scenario for so many people, right? What we don't realize that one single plastic brush takes more than 400 years to biodegrade. And this is a kind of meta value, right, which comes from metacognition. So Indic psychology is not just about boardrooms and classrooms, but Indic psychology is about everyday small decisions that are taken based on values. And obviously from meta values like compassion comes our meta skills. And these meta skills are our everyday interactions, or every day how do we live life. So one of the skill could be self-care and other care. Another skill can be understanding emotions and emotional intelligence integrated in everyday life.
Ma'am, it was so interesting that in your answer, I could understand that some of the key characteristics of Indian psychology are that it's value based, it talks about having metacognition and having something called as meta skills, and how it always talks about being connected to regenerative thinking, regenerative living, as well as being always connected to Mother Nature. I think we have ventured into a lot of new ideas through this questionnaire, and it's really given a lot for us to think about. Thank you very much for helping us find such new perspective on psychology and telling us the very importance of why its decolonization is the way ahead. Thank you very much, and we'll see
Thank you
you in
so
the
much.
next talk. Namaste, ma'am.
Namaste. Thank you, Ojas.